Not everything happened as we thought it would. So Viyaschlev Molotov says in his book, Molotov Remembers. Of course, you might not remember Molotov. Viyaschlev Molotov worked closely with Vladimir Lenin and then was one of Stalin's closest allies, even serving briefly as head of the NKVD. He signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, as well as later negotiating alliances with the Allies and with Mao Zedong as well. After Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, and Bukharin, he was arguably the fifth Beatle in terms of prominence in the USSR's history pre-Khrushchev. But despite having both the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the Molotov cocktail named after him, he's largely forgotten today. It was hard to even find footage of the guy, which is why the footage I'm using is relatively low quality. One of the things that's very interesting about Molotov's story is that unlike former Stalin allies like Anastas Mikoyan, who when Khrushchev came to power switched sides from Stalin to join Khrushchev, Molotov was one of those who chose to sacrifice his career by standing with Stalin's legacy, and as such retired to live the rest of his life from 1957 as a modest pensioner. He also refused to edit his memoir in line with the wishes of Khrushchev and Brezhnev, and so it was never published. Instead of writing a memoir, a collection of his conversations with the poet Felix Chuev was published instead. What makes this work so important is that same fact that arguably Stalin's closest ever advisor didn't let himself be censored, that he spoke what he wanted to say, even if it meant the cost of his own influence. The preludes of each chapter by another historian who didn't actually do the interviews themselves are extremely anti-USSR and of questionable worth at all, but the conversations themselves are very enlightening. The prose is a bit rambly and ranty, and can get repetitive since it's a transcript of over 100 different conversations over a course of decades, and also Molotov does have some problematic instances of racism. It's positive racism. He says like how Jews are very industrious and hardworking, but it's still very racist to essentialize people in that way, and he also does display, in my opinion, some great Russian chauvinism, while saying it's not great Russian chauvinism at the same time, but this book is still very fascinating as a look into such a significant historical figure. Molotov is basically the only person who has an actual account about the USSR under Stalin that actually worked closely with Stalin and remained loyal to Stalin until his death. So this is a very valuable book to get insights into how Molotov and probably similarly Stalin saw things from their perspective. I don't want to spoil the book too much, but here are some of the most interesting quotes that I found. Molotov argues that Lenin specifically and directly was the main reason that the USSR actually followed a specifically socialist line among the Bolsheviks. So, in Lenin's case, the whole great man theory of history might be actually somewhat accurate. Of course, this is Molotov's memory from 50 years ago or so, but the way he tells it, it does seem to imply that it was specifically and directly Lenin who was responsible for the USSR ever coming to power, because he was the one that helped push the Bolsheviks in a different direction. Molotov says that it was specifically Lenin who pushed for Stalin's appointment as secretary in 1922, and while there isn't any direct documentary evidence of this, this is also something that a lot of other historians have also backed up. Molotov mentions that the anarchist Makhno actually helped the Soviets by accident in a battle, which is kind of funny to me to think that an anarchist helped save the Bolsheviks, who are of course despised by a lot of anarchists both then and today. Molotov also implies that it was likely Lenin himself that made the decision to shoot the Tsar's entire family. He spends some time talking about the reasonings for how quickly the USSR industrialized and how that industrialization helped prepare them for war, and also talks about his reasonings for agreeing to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which helped confirm a lot of my own suspicions, which is that it was a delaying tactic, which just makes a lot of sense when you think logically of how Hitler literally wrote in Mein Kampf that he was going to colonize the East, how Hitler ruthlessly persecuted socialists in his own country, and also how Hitler was known for constantly betraying diplomatic deals he made with other people. So the USSR would have been incredibly dumb to think that the Molotov Pact was any sort of long-term thing. The weirdest quote from the book is where Molotov sort of justifies the execution of a guy because he was, quote, too easygoing about the opposition. Being generous and trying to understand his perspective, I think what he's trying to say is that Rude's attack would have been used to nefarious means by the USSR's enemies, and also just that at that time in the Great Purge, things were so dangerous that just associating with people not approved of is what got him killed in the end. I don't really think he approves of Rudistak being killed at all. He's just saying Rudistak made the mistake of not being more careful in a time where especially high-ranking officials like he was were being arrested for basically anything. I think the fact that Molotov wasn't just condoning his death is simply expressed in the fact that he repeatedly throughout the book expresses his regret and sadness that many mistakes were indeed made. There's also sometimes a claim that people in the Moscow trials weren't tortured to get out confessions, or at least most of them weren't. But at the very least, Molotov visited Rudistak and observed that he did look like he had been tortured. Rudistak wasn't a part of the Moscow trials, but it's at least some evidence that those people might have also been tortured as well, given Molotov's testimony about Rudistak. One of the most interesting claims Molotov makes is that Stalin claimed to Molotov in 1952 that the USSR was no longer a dictatorship of the proletariat. I'm not sure what to make of Molotov's explanation after this when he talks about toilers, so comment if you understand what he's trying to say here exactly. Molotov also argues that Stalin had lost a lot of his mental capacity in the post-World War II years from the stress of being in charge, which is why he apparently began to get suspicious of even Molotov himself. Molotov also implies that Beria very likely killed Stalin rather than Stalin dying naturally of old age, and even says that Beria hinted to Molotov that he killed Stalin. Finally, here are some other quotes that I don't have any actual commentary on, but I still think are worth sharing. And of course, this isn't every interesting thing that can be found in the book. I still recommend reading the book because I'm certain there are interesting parts that I also missed. In the end, one of my main takeaways from the book was just that Molotov was almost certainly a genuine believer in socialism. There are many parts in the book where he's speaking in very socialist language, talking about imperialism, the workers, and so on, but not just in a way where it sounds like he's reciting what he's read in books or putting on airs, but in a way that seems to imply that he really did believe in the idea of socialism to his bones. All in all though, if you're interested in the history of the USSR, I highly recommend this book. Also, Felix Chuev, the poet that interviewed Molotov, also interviewed another of Stalin's very oldest and closest advisors, Lazar Kaganovich, in a shorter book. Like Molotov, Kaganovich was not allowed to publish his memoirs because he also remained loyal to Stalin after Khrushchev's coup in 1957, so his conversations with Chuev are the only records that remain. I've looked all over the internet for a copy in English, and I haven't been able to find anything except an excerpt, so if anyone has access to a copy, do let me know. Well, that's about all I have to say for this video. If you liked the video, please like, comment, and subscribe. And you can also support me on Patreon, where you can get early access to my videos as well as other perks. A big thanks also to my $8 patron, Alexander Bernstein, as well as to my $4 patrons, Billy from Texas, Citizen Smith, Famous Horse, Pivot 5000, Professional Tanky, Richard Scott Wigton, and Shivaru. Finally, thank you to my $2 patrons, Ashton Spine, John Trimbath, Matthew Foy, Misling, Southpaw 99, and Dust Ballet. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.